Okay, so this tutorial is designed to cover the idea of UV mapping, or actually UV unwrapping and then UV mapping or UVW mapping of architectural objects. So this one is specifically looking at the idea of using an unwrap tool for texture mapping architectural geometry. So I have this little set piece that I've built in Revit. I've linked it across to 3D Studio Max, and I'm getting ready to take ownership of the lighting and texture mapping and those things that 3D Studio Max does quite a bit better than Revit. So what I'm going to start with is creating a new lighting setup. Lights, daylight system. I'm going to click to drag a compass and then click to place the sun. And again, the height of the sun doesn't particularly matter. It's only directional. That is a sunlight, so it is assuming that that light source is infinitely far away for the intensive purpose of lighting. I want this sunlight coming in through those windows right here in this scene. So I'm actually going to rotate the compass around, getting true north about 180 degrees from where it currently is. So I'm going to select my compass, my rotate tool. I'm just going to spin that around. And then by selecting the light, I'm going to go to my Modify tab, Setup, and I'm just going to change it to more of a winter month, like let's say October, maybe fall. And you can see that light source is now much lower in the sky. It's going to be coming in nicely through those windows. So the next thing that I want to do is let's just go ahead, and that is the current camera for this viewport, camera 1. And again, if you've forgotten how to set that up, I'm just going to right-click on that cameras, and then I've selected camera 01 to get that view. I'm going to go ahead and do a quick rendering of that just to see what we have right now. And it should be something that's fairly dark. We haven't done anything to establish type of force. So I'm going to cancel that right there. And I'm going to go to Rendering, Exposure Control, and I'm going to go ahead and just use a simple preset of physically based lighting, indoor daylight. Close that. I'm going to hit F9 to render again. And now you can see it's much brighter. We're going to see much more detail on the inside. And essentially what that's done is that's changed my exposure setting, no different than changing the exposure on a camera to allow more light through the aperture and a longer exposure time. So happy with how that's starting to render. I don't really need to render out the whole thing. I'm going to go ahead and stop it, close it, and let's proceed with unwrapping this set of walls right here. So I'm going to select that outer perimeter of the walls. I'm going to go to my Modify tab, and I'm going to add a UVW Unwrap modifier. From here, I'm going to open the UV editor, and I'm going to zoom out in my UV editor. And what you're seeing right now are sort of all of these walls overlapping each other, and that's currently how those walls would have a texture projected onto them. And what I want to do is essentially use UVW unwrapping to place all those walls so I can work on them in a single texture map in Photoshop. So to start doing that, I'm going to select my polygon tool. I'm going to lasso all of the walls, and then I'm going to go to Flatten by Face Angle. So that moves all of the walls into my texture mapping space right here inside of the Edit UVW panel. And the next thing I'm going to do is I know right off the bat that they're not oriented exactly like I want them to be for exporting this template into Photoshop. And I know a simple 90-degree rotation is going to help me out with that. And then I want to go ahead and make sure that they are roughly centered inside of this map. From here, I'm going to export this into Photoshop. So to do that, I'm going to go to Tools, Render UVW Template. I need this to be fairly high resolution. So I'm actually going to set up a 4,000 by 4,000 pixel image. And I'm going to say Render UVW Template. And I'm going to save this out. I want my alpha channel for sure on this. So I'm going to save this as a UVW wall, and I'm going to save this as a .png file. So inside of Photoshop, now I can go File, Open, and I'm going to select my PNG file, UVW wall, 4000 by 4000 pixels. And what I get right away, it's hard to see what's happening right here because everything is transparent. But once I add a background layer, you'll actually be able to see the wireframe outlines that we want to build a texture on top of. So I'm going to add 2 new layers in. I'm going to name this one Background. And I'm going to add 1 more new layer in, and I'm going to call this layer Numbers. And I'm going to make the obvious decision of putting the background as the background layer in Photoshop. Then I'm going to use my paint bucket to paint the entire background layer black. And right away, you can start to actually see those lines now from the template right here. So on my numbers layer, what I want to do in Photoshop is just give each one of these walls a really simple ID marker. So to do that, I'm going to come in and use my paintbrush with a white color, and I'm just going to number them really roughly 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. These smaller pieces I don't really care about. Those are the sides and edges of walls. My blanket texture map or my tile texture map that I'm going to put together in Photoshop should cover all of those. If I see a weird error to one of them, we could always move it and line it up very carefully with a wall, but right now I'm not too worried about that. So from here, I'm going to do a really simple save as, file, save as. I'm going to send this right back to the same folder that I'm working as. And my method as of late has simply been using a JPEG file. I really don't want to flatten this out. I use file, save as. I want to keep my layers, so I'm going to keep a Photoshop file running and a JPEG file running, and it'll be that JPEG file that I continually import into 3D Studio Max. So I'm going to keep this name, uvwwall.jpg. And now we're going to bounce back into 3D Studio. And I want to do 2 things. First, I want to overwrite this checker pattern with that texture map. So I'm going to click this drop down. I'm going to go to Pick Texture, Bitmap, UVW Textures, and that is my JPEG file. Open. Now I can see sort of an overlay of the actual geometry and the texture map, how those 2 elements are going to relate. Now, I haven't actually applied that texture map to my geometry yet in 3D Studio, so that's my next step. I'm going to go ahead and close the Edit UVW window and open up my material editor. So I'm going to drag and drop from Mental Ray, Arc and Design, and I'm going to double click on this panel, and we're going to name this UVW Wall Brick. And I'm just going to use a standard matte finish as my default template. At this point, what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and link this material to my wall. And so now what you can see is any modification that I might start making to the color should be showing up on that wall. So what I'm going to do essentially is I'm going to overwrite that color with the UVW Unwrapped texture map by clicking that little button, Bitmap, and I'm going to select UVW Wall JPEG. Now, the next thing that I need to do, if you notice, it's not showing up here yet. That's because I've got to turn it on in the viewports. Once I turn that on, you see this little half red, half blue. That lets us know that that is showing up in real time. The reason why that exists is if your computer starts to bog down, if you have a lot of geometry with a lot of high-resolution texture maps, you might actually want to turn some of those off to get your real-time 3D navigation speed back up a bit. So everything looks pretty good. I can see my number 2, my number 3, my number 4, but one of the things that's a little bit off is number 6. And number 5. They're both rotated the wrong way. And that's not a huge deal, but it would be a lot easier if everything was oriented the exact same direction for me to work with inside of Photoshop. So I'm going to make that quick fix. So I'm going to close the material editor. I'm going to open the UVW editor back up. And by choosing polygons again, I'm going to highlight the geometry for number 5. I hope. There we go. Highlight the geometry for number 5, and I'm going to rotate it. And let's see if I rotated the right direction here. And I rotated it exactly like I shouldn't have. So let's go back through that one more time. A little bit of excitement there happening. Sorry. Let's go 1, 2, and that should have it this time. There we go. Spin this around. Look at number 6, our face number 6. I'm going to highlight that, and let's see if we got it right that time. Okay, so now both of those things are aligned correctly. So now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And I'll know in Photoshop exactly which surface I'm painting. And in particular with this camera view, I'm sort of most interested in wall number 4 or face number 4, which is this one right here in the center of my template. So since I've made a minor modification to these, it's probably a good thing to go ahead and re-render out the UVW template. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go mapping. Oh, excuse me, I'm going to go tools, render UVW template, and I'm just going to re-render out another 4000 by 4000 pixel image. And I'm going to resave this image as UVW wall dash edit 1 .png, because again I want to keep that alpha channel for that material. So I'm going to go ahead and say save and OK. From that point I'm going to go ahead and go back into Photoshop, File, Open, and I'm going to select UVW wall edit 1 .png. Select all, and what I want to do is copy this information back into my previous file. So select all, edit, copy. I'm going to make a new layer right here and say edit, paste. And you can see, oh, let's do that one more time. Let's do that as an edit, paste special, paste in place. That's very important. That way I keep all the pixels locked in for that. Thank you, Baxter Reeser, for pointing that out to me the other day. Completely forgot about it. So let's take a look at the two different UVW templates here. That's template 1. This is our edited template. Really minor change, but if I start moving those walls around to sort of make a seamless connection across, let's say, face 3 and 4 or 4 and 5, re-rendering out that template might be really, really important in terms of how I work with the texture map in Photoshop. So I know I can go ahead and delete layer 0. Not copy it, actually want to delete it. There we go. And so now I've got a revised base map to do my texture work on. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in a brick texture. So I'm going to take this texture map right here, select all, edit, copy, and I'm going to make a new layer, brick, and I want that layer on top of everything. And now I'm going to go edit, paste. So the first thing that I want to do with this now is I notice that brick is huge. Those would be like 1 foot tall bricks, probably even larger than that. So I'm going to go ahead and say edit, transform, scale. And I'm going to drop the size of that down to something that actually starts to match a more realistic scale for what those bricks would be. So you can see right there, that's more appropriate. I know this wall is about 20 feet tall. The scale of that brickwork now looks much more believable. So I want to go ahead and make this a tileable pattern inside of Photoshop. So to accomplish that, what I'm going to do is select all. So I'm selecting all of the brick on that layer, file or edit, copy, file, new. and then I'm going to go edit, paste. From here, I'm just going to go select all, edit, define pattern, and we're just going to call this brick 1. Okay. Back in my wall template, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this little bit of brickwork that I've done. There we go. New layer, brick. And this time I'm going to use my paint bucket on the brick layer. But rather than just the traditional foreground painting, I'm going to change that to pattern. And I'm going to select brick 1 as my pattern. And that repeats the tile over everything. I'm going to go ahead and drop my opacity down a little bit so I can see the pieces underneath. And then I'm going to add a few more details to this texture map, or this wall number 4 right here. So I'm going to grab this steampunk image and use it as a little bit of graffiti. So I'm going to go select all, edit, copy, edit. Let's make a new layer for it to paste it into. New layer, edit, paste. I'm going to change the layer type to multiply. Want to be able to actually see the brick through there a little bit. Edit, transform, scale again. I want to make it a little bit smaller, kind of position it up above that staircase, and enter. And then I'm going to sort of just really quickly erase some of those edges to get it to blend into the brick a little bit. Complete slop artist job with this. But it's the concept that I'm trying to get across. That's sort of the most important element. I'm going to pull that over here. To do something a little more realistic, sometimes you don't have time to build all of the geometry that might be in your scene. So one of the things that you might do is actually take pieces of photographs and start to compile those into your UV unwrapping as well. So I'm going to grab the picture of this door and place that in as well. If you notice, there's one really odd part of this door, and that's this bad shadow right here. So I'm just going to grab this piece of the door and do a quick edit, copy, edit, paste, replace that. Should be convincing enough that no one really notices that quick edit. I'm going to flatten this image because I want to make sure I'm grabbing both layers. And I'm going to use my rectangular marquee and get just to the outside edge so that I've got a little bit of artificial shadow cast. Edit, copy, edit, paste, zoom out just a bit, edit, transform, scale. And I'm going to place this right down here, make it about an 8-foot tall door. And hopefully that'll kind of slide real politely there underneath the staircase and second level. So I'm going to take this. I want to make sure that I'm not seeing these numbers anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and start hiding some layers. And the simplest way to do that really is to simply change the opacity of the brick. Now I can go File, Save As. I'm going to save this as a JPEG file that will automatically flatten all of my layers for me. UVW wall brick 1. Okay. Then back inside of 3D Studio Max, I can open up my material editor. I'm going to double click on the texture map that we're working with. I'm going to select my material, and I'm going to replace this bitmap texture with our current one. UVW wall brick 1. Open. Close the material editor, and let's go ahead and render this interior view. Part of this go in is to link the UV view. So as we get to the wall, we actually see a little more of the geometry. But in doing that, we actually don't want this door piece and the graffiti piece to start overriding the bump map. We actually want the brick to be the primary driving force behind the bump map work. Or actually take back, we actually did the bump of the door, but not of the graffiti. So let's go ahead and bounce into Photoshop and let's export one more file while that finishes rendering. So I'm actually going to hide the graffiti layer. I'm going to take this entire image and desaturate it. Image, adjustments, desaturate. A black and white file is a little easier to work with in terms of creating a bump map because we can play with the contrast in a more sort of extreme kind of way. I'm going to raise the contrast up and the brightness up a little bit because I'm interested in those sort of extreme whites and blacks. And I'm going to say OK. And again, I'm going to do a File, Save As, UVW wall dash brick dash bump. Except the one problem that I just had was I just saved that as a Photoshop file. I really want a JPEG file out of that. So I'm going to run through that one more time. File, Save As, and this time I'm actually going to save that as a JPEG file. There we go. Then inside of 3D Studio Max, I'm going to open my material editor back up. And I'm going to go ahead and scroll down on my file right here to bump map, bitmap, and I'm going to select UVW wall brick bump and say OK. I'm going to turn that bump map up a little bit and we'll do one more rendering. So there's probably not going to be a drastic difference in terms of the camera location right now, but as you would get close to walls, you actually see the bump, the brick, affecting, but not affecting the door because of how we managed and exported those layers from Photoshop. And in short, that's sort of the introduction to UVW unwrapping in 3D Studio Max for architectural work. If you have any questions, drop me a note, dbeach01@drury.edu.